The sound of crystal shattering against mahogany echoed through the Blackwell mansion on a sweltering August night in 1854, followed by a scream that would haunt Memphis society for the next 50 years. What began as a gentleman's card game in one of Tennessee's most prestigious households ended with a wager so morally bankrupt that 3 families would be destroyed, 1 man would die under mysterious circumstances, and a scandal would reach the desk of the governor himself. The stakes that night were not money or land. They were the future of a 20-year-old woman and the freedom of the most educated man in Shelby County, regardless of the color of his skin. And when the final card fell, the aftermath would expose the rotting foundation beneath Memphis's gilded society. Thomas Blackwell stood at the pinnacle of Memphis prosperity in 1854. His cotton warehouses along the Mississippi River processed over £2 million annually, and his investments in the Memphis and Charleston Railroad had quadrupled his inherited fortune. At 46, Thomas embodied everything the city's elite aspired to become: wealthy, politically connected, and utterly confident in his ability to control every aspect of his world. His Greek Revival mansion on Adams Avenue was where power brokers gathered to discuss the future of Tennessee, where deals were made that influenced elections, and where his Thursday night card games had become legendary among men who measured their worth in influence rather than mere dollars. Thomas's daughter Emily was 20 years old that summer, possessed of a sharp intelligence that made her father simultaneously proud and uneasy. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had developed an unfortunate habit of reading newspapers and forming opinions about politics. Her striking beauty, dark hair and blue eyes that seemed to see through social pretense, had attracted proposals from prominent families across 3 states. But Emily had rejected them all, insisting she would marry for affection rather than advantage, a notion her father found both charming and impractical. The Blackwell household also included a man named Daniel Freeman, whose very existence challenged every assumption about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. Daniel was 38 years old, born on the Blackwell plantation, and had somehow learned not only to read and write, but had developed an extraordinary understanding of law, finance, and the political machinery of Tennessee. Thomas had discovered Daniel's abilities years earlier during an accounting error, and in a decision that scandalized his neighbors, had begun using Daniel to manage complex business transactions and even draft legal documents. This arrangement had proven extraordinarily profitable, but it had also created something dangerous in the social order of 1854 Memphis. A man who legally owned nothing but knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking, in Memphis's business elite. The other players in Thomas's regular game were men whose names appeared on bank charters and political appointments throughout West Tennessee. Robert Ashford owned the largest cotton plantation in Shelby County and served as a state representative, his opinions on agricultural policy carrying weight in Nashville. Dr. Henry Morrison ran the most successful medical practice in Memphis and held financial interests in nearly every major business venture in the city. And then there was James Carrington, newly arrived from New Orleans with a fortune of mysterious origin, a talent for cards that bordered on supernatural, and a reputation for ruthlessness that his expensive suits and cultured accent only partially concealed. These 4 men had been meeting every Thursday evening for 18 months, and their games had evolved from friendly competition to something darker. The stakes had grown steadily, from hundreds of dollars to thousands, but money had ceased to be the real currency they traded. These games had become about testing each other's resolve, about psychological warfare waged by men who already had everything material wealth could provide and were searching for more intoxicating forms of power. The evening of August 7th began with an oppressive heat that even the mansion's high ceilings and open windows could not relieve. Daniel had prepared the card room as usual, ensuring the imported brandy was properly chilled, the Cuban cigars were fresh, and the green felt table was perfectly arranged. But those who knew Daniel well might have noticed something different about him that evening. A certain deliberateness in his movements, a way his intelligent eyes seemed to be cataloging every detail of the room and the men gathering in it. Robert Ashford arrived first, complaining about the political situation in Nashville and the growing northern agitation over slavery. At 58, he was the eldest of their group, a man whose family had helped write Tennessee's Constitution and who viewed any challenge to the existing social order as personal affront. Dr. Morrison came next, his medical bag in hand as always, since emergencies could arise at any hour among the hundreds of people whose health depended on his services. James Carrington was last to arrive, and his entrance transformed the atmosphere completely. At 42, James possessed a predatory charm that made even seasoned businessmen uncomfortable. His education at European universities and his years in New Orleans's gambling houses had given him skills that went far beyond simple card playing. The first hours of the game proceeded normally, with moderate pots and the usual conversation about cotton prices, railroad expansion, and the upcoming gubernatorial election. But as midnight approached and the brandy began its work, James's demeanor shifted. He had been losing consistently throughout the evening, and those familiar with his temperament recognized the dangerous combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and his particular brand of recklessness. Thomas found himself holding unusually strong hands throughout the night, his confidence growing with each pot he won. By 1 in the morning, he was ahead by nearly $1,500, a substantial sum that represented what most Tennessee families might earn in 2 years. It was then that James made a suggestion that would shatter multiple lives. He set down his brandy glass with exaggerated care, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of casualness and calculation that made Daniel pause in his movement around the room. "Gentlemen, I find myself growing bored with these modest stakes. What do you say we make this evening truly memorable?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, his judgment clouded by brandy and success. "What did you have in mind, James?" "I propose one final hand. Winner takes everything on the table, plus something that actually matters. Something that will make this night legendary in Memphis society." Dr. Morrison's face went pale. "James, you are drunk and you are talking dangerously." "Am I?" James replied, his smile cold and calculating. "Or am I simply willing to acknowledge what we all know but pretend not to? That these games stopped being about money months ago. What we are really testing here is our willingness to risk what we truly value for the chance to demonstrate our superiority." Robert Ashford had gone completely still in his chair, and Daniel noticed that the older man's hands were trembling slightly. "James, what exactly are you proposing we wager?" "I will put up my New Orleans properties," James said. "The house on Royal Street, the warehouse district holdings, and my shares in the riverboat company. Total value exceeds $20,000. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of a steamboat whistle from the Mississippi. $20,000 was an enormous sum, enough to establish a new plantation or fund a significant political campaign. Thomas felt a dangerous excitement building in his chest. "James, that is far beyond what any of us can match in liquid assets." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Thomas. Each of you has something worth $20,000 or more. You simply have not been thinking creatively about your assets. Robert could wager his plantation and his political position. Henry could wager his medical practice and his business investments. And you, Thomas," James's smile widened, showing teeth, "you could wager something far more valuable than property. You could wager your daughter's hand in marriage." The words hung in the humid air like poison. Daniel, who had been refilling the brandy decanter, went completely rigid. Robert Ashford actually gasped, while Dr. Morrison stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. Thomas's first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss the suggestion as the brandy talking. But something in James's expression, something in the challenge implicit in his tone, made him hesitate. In the social hierarchy of 1854 Memphis, a man's ability to control his family's destiny was the ultimate measure of power. To refuse such a wager might suggest weakness, an admission that he lacked confidence in his own abilities. "James," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "you are suggesting something that goes beyond any reasonable understanding of gambling. A young woman's life should not be wagered like property." "But we do wager property, Henry," James replied smoothly. "We wager it all the time. At least this way the matter would be decided by skill and chance rather than backroom negotiations and financial calculations." "Is that really so different from how marriages are arranged in our circles?" Thomas found himself actually considering the proposition, though a rational part of his mind screamed warnings. Emily was his greatest treasure, intelligent and beautiful and destined for a marriage that would cement the Blackwell family's position at the apex of Memphis society. But he also possessed absolute legal authority over her future. The law was utterly clear on this matter. "And if I were to agree to such terms," Thomas heard himself saying, "what would you put up to match such a stake?" James leaned forward, and for just a moment his mask of southern gentility slipped entirely, revealing something calculating and predatory underneath. "I would wager Daniel Freeman." The room erupted into chaos. Robert Ashford began shouting about moral boundaries and legal consequences. Dr. Morrison was attempting to intervene, his medical training making him acutely aware of the dangerous psychological territory they had entered. But James raised his hand for silence, and something in his authority made even Robert's protests die away. "Consider it rationally, gentlemen. Daniel represents significant financial value as property, but more importantly, he possesses knowledge and skills that make him effectively irreplaceable. Thomas depends on Daniel's intellectual abilities in ways that go far beyond normal master-slave relationships. Losing Daniel would be devastating to the Blackwell business empire." Thomas stared at James, realizing that the man had been studying the Blackwell household dynamics far more carefully than anyone had suspected. It was true that Daniel had become indispensable, not just to the plantation's financial management, but to Thomas's sense of intellectual companionship. Their evening discussions about business strategy had become one of Thomas's genuine pleasures. But there was something else in James's proposal, something that made Thomas's blood run simultaneously hot and cold. By wagering Daniel, James was offering Thomas the chance to win complete control over another man's exceptional mind, to own genius itself. Daniel stood motionless near the brandy table, his face carefully neutral, but his hands gripping the crystal decanter so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Everyone in the room understood they were discussing his fate as if he were furniture, and the legal reality of 1854 Tennessee made his opinion irrelevant. Thomas felt the weight of 3 sets of eyes on him, waiting for his decision. The brandy, the competitive pride, the opportunity to assert ultimate dominance over these men who considered themselves his equals, all of it overwhelmed his better judgment. "Gentlemen," Thomas said finally, his voice steadier than he felt, "I believe we have the makings of a historic game." The decision to proceed created an atmosphere so tense that even the oppressive August heat seemed to intensify. Robert Ashford made one final attempt at protest, arguing that no card game should determine innocent lives, but Thomas's mind was made up. Dr. Morrison found himself drawn into the proceedings despite his moral revulsion, fascinated by the psychological drama unfolding before him. James began shuffling the cards with elaborate precision, his movements almost hypnotic in the lamplight. "5-card draw," he announced. "One hand, winner takes all. Are we in agreement on the terms?" Thomas nodded, though his mouth had gone completely dry. "If I win, I keep Emily and gain ownership of Daniel. If you win, you gain the right to marry Emily and I retain Daniel." "Precisely," James confirmed. "Though I should mention one additional detail. Daniel will deal the cards." The suggestion sent another shock through the room. Having an enslaved person deal the cards for a game with such enormous stakes was virtually unprecedented. But James's reasoning was characteristically manipulative. Who better to ensure fairness than someone whose own fate hangs in the balance? Daniel has every incentive to deal honestly, does he not? Daniel's hands trembled visibly as he took the deck from James. The irony was suffocating. The man whose life was being wagered would determine the outcome. The cards were dealt with agonizing slowness. Daniel's movements were precise and mechanical, and Thomas found himself watching the enslaved man's face for any sign of manipulation, but Daniel's expression remained absolutely neutral, his dark eyes focused entirely on the mechanics of the deal. Thomas received his 5 cards and felt a surge of confidence. 3 queens stared back at him, a powerful hand that would win most games. James examined his cards with an expression that revealed nothing. "I will take 2 cards," James said. Thomas opted to hold his 3 queens and draw 2 more. The cards Daniel dealt him were a 10 and a jack, different suits. Still, 3 queens was a strong hand, strong enough that Thomas felt his confidence growing. The betting proceeded in tense silence. Thomas pushed his entire night's winnings into the center of the table, over $1,500. James matched the bet without hesitation and then raised an additional 1,000. Thomas matched the raise, his heart pounding. The moment of truth arrived. Thomas laid down his 3 queens with barely concealed triumph. "Queens over jack and 10, he announced. James looked at his cards for a long moment, then slowly began laying them down one by one. 7 of spades. 7 of diamonds. 7 of clubs. 7 of hearts. And finally, with what might have been the suggestion of a smile, the 2 of hearts. 4 sevens. In poker, 4 of a kind beats 3 of a kind. James had won. The silence that followed was more profound than death. Thomas stared at the cards as if they might somehow rearrange themselves, as if reality itself might be negotiable. He had wagered his daughter's future on his ability to read men and cards, and he had been completely outplayed. Robert Ashford had gone pale, his breathing shallow. Dr. Morrison looked as though he might be sick. And Daniel, still standing near the card table, showed no expression at all. "Gentlemen," James said softly, "I believe the game is concluded. Thomas, I will give you until Monday to inform Emily of the situation and begin the necessary legal arrangements. I expect we can have the wedding ceremony completed within the month." The words cut through Thomas's shock like a knife. The wedding ceremony. His daughter, married to this predator of a man because Thomas had been too arrogant and drunk to recognize the danger until it was far too late. Daniel moved silently to begin cleaning up the room, collecting empty glasses and straightening furniture, but Robert Ashford noticed something. "Daniel," Robert said slowly, "your hands are not shaking anymore. Why is that?" Daniel looked up, and for the first time since the game began, his expression changed. What showed on his face was not fear or resignation but something that might have been satisfaction. "Because, Mr. Ashford, the worst has already happened. What comes next can only be improvement." The cryptic comment was lost in the chaos of the other men's departure. James left with quiet satisfaction, Robert and Henry departed in stunned silence, and Thomas was left alone in his card room, staring at the cards that had destroyed his world. It was Daniel who finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying a strange authority that Thomas had never heard before. "Master Thomas, there is something you should know. The game was not fair." Thomas looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I know how Mr. Carrington won. And I am saying that within 3 days, every prominent citizen in Memphis will know it as well. Because tomorrow morning, I am going to the offices of the Memphis Daily Appeal, and I am going to tell them everything that happened tonight. Every detail of the wager, every word spoken, every card played. And I am going to explain exactly why what happened in this room tonight was not just morally wrong but legally questionable under Tennessee law." Thomas stared at Daniel in complete shock. "If you do that, you will be punished. Enslaved people who make accusations against their masters face severe consequences." "I know," Daniel replied calmly. "But I realized something tonight while I was dealing those cards. I realized that I am tired of being property. Tired of being wagered and traded. And I realized that if I am going to be punished anyway, I might as well make sure the punishment is for something that matters. Something that might prevent other innocent people from being destroyed by men like you and Mr. Carrington." What Daniel had understood, what none of the men in their arrogance had recognized, was that he possessed something they did not. He had detailed knowledge of every questionable business dealing, every legal shortcut, every moral compromise that had built their fortunes. And he had spent months carefully documenting it all, creating a record that would be devastating if made public. His threat to go to the newspaper was not empty. He had already prepared written testimony, already made contact with abolitionist sympathizers in Memphis, already ensured that if anything happened to him, the information would be released anyway. Thomas spent a sleepless night wrestling with impossible choices. By dawn, he understood that Daniel had created a situation where any move Thomas made would result in catastrophic consequences. If he tried to silence Daniel, the prearranged release of information would destroy him. If he allowed Daniel to go public, the scandal would destroy him. And if he tried to proceed with the marriage to James, he would face both public outrage and potential criminal charges. The elegant trap Daniel had constructed offered no escape. The Memphis Daily Appeal published Daniel's account on Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon, the story had spread through the city like wildfire. By Sunday, ministers were preaching sermons about the moral corruption of the wealthy. By Monday, the governor's office had opened an official investigation into what they termed coercive gambling practices involving human lives. The speed and thoroughness of the response shocked everyone except Daniel, who had spent months planning for exactly this outcome. Emily Blackwell's response to the scandal was perhaps the most devastating consequence for Thomas. When she learned what her father had done, she did not cry or rage. Instead, she calmly informed him that she was leaving Memphis, that she would be accepting a teaching position in Boston that an abolitionist contact of Daniel's had arranged, and that she never wanted to speak to her father again. She left Tennessee within the week, and Thomas would not see his daughter for the remaining 12 years of his life. The investigation that followed destroyed all 4 men in different ways. James Carrington was arrested for fraud after investigators discovered he had marked the cards, a fact Daniel had observed but said nothing about during the game itself, waiting instead for the perfect moment to reveal it. James died in jail 6 months later, killed by another inmate in what authorities ruled a gambling dispute. Thomas Blackwell lost his political connections and saw his business partnerships dissolve as former associates scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. He was forced to sell most of his property to pay legal fees and settlements, and he died in 1866, a broken man living in a modest house on the outskirts of Memphis. Robert Ashford resigned from the legislature and retreated to his plantation, dying less than 2 years later of what his family called a broken heart. Dr. Morrison's medical practice survived but never fully recovered its prestige, and he spent his remaining years treating the poor rather than the wealthy patients who had once sought his services. Daniel Freeman's fate proved most complex. The scandal created political pressure that eventually resulted in his manumission, purchased by an organization of Northern abolitionists who recognized his courage and intelligence. He moved to Boston, where he was reunited with Emily Blackwell, and together they established a school for freed people that operated successfully for decades. Daniel published a memoir in 1859 titled Chains of My Own Breaking that became influential in abolitionist circles. In it, he revealed the full extent of his manipulation that night, how he had recognized James's card marking, how he had dealt the cards in a way that ensured James would win, understanding that the resulting scandal would be so outrageous it could not be covered up. Sometimes, Daniel wrote in his memoir, justice requires us to let evil triumph temporarily so that its true nature can be exposed completely. I dealt those cards knowing that Miss Emily's temporary peril would lead to her permanent liberation, both from an unwanted marriage and from a father who viewed her as property to be wagered. And I dealt them knowing that my own freedom might come from the scandal rather than from mercy. The Memphis wager, as it became known, influenced Tennessee law for generations. Legal reforms strengthened protections against coercive marriage contracts and established precedents about informed consent that extended far beyond gambling contexts. The case demonstrated that even within oppressive systems, intelligent and determined individuals could find ways to use those very systems against themselves, that speaking truth to power remained possible even in the most restrictive circumstances. The card room at the Blackwell mansion was sealed after Thomas's death and remained untouched for decades, becoming the subject of local ghost stories about voices that could still be heard arguing through the walls. Whether these phenomena had natural explanations or represented something more mysterious, they served as a permanent reminder that the consequences of one night's arrogance and cruelty could echo through generations, and that sometimes the seemingly powerless possess the most devastating power of all, the truth.